Hi and welcome back to Bike Speed. So this week we're going to give this lovely Dolan a full strip down and service. We're going to change the bottom bracket bearings, they were absolutely worn out. We're going to change the rear wheel bearings and the rear hub bearings, so a full rebuild on the rear wheel. We're going to strip the bike completely back to the frame, detail it, ceramic coat it, get everything lubricated nicely and get this bike fully serviced and ready to go. So as you can see, there's a little bit of build up on this bike, but not too bad. This bike is in immaculate condition. Even things like the chain weren't that worn. You can see there that that chain doesn't need replacing. It's got plenty of miles in that. But the customer did tell me that unfortunately his bike had been run over and he damaged one of the wheels. The front wheel had been driven over and destroyed. So these were wheels that he'd recently brought, and we're going to bring those up to speed because they had a couple of little gremlins with them. So initially we get the bike stripped down. You can see on the chain and this cassette how they built up with a little bit of oil, but it's not too pasty at this stage, so it's not too bad. Good time to get them serviced, get them all degreased, get the chain re-lubricated nicely, and that will all stay clean and fresh then. So because this is a full detail service, we're going to strip the bike completely back to the frame. So we'll even take things like the hanger off on this service, get these jockey wheels and this derailleur cleaned up, and it will run absolutely perfectly once the service is done. You can see there the front derailleur wasn't too bad. But listen to those bearings, they're very tired. Long overdue replacing. But this actually threw up my first problem with this bike. When I took the chain set off, there should be a cover on that bearing that wasn't there. And actually I quickly realised it was on the non-drive side. The covers have been put on the wrong way round. The non-drive side has its own pre-tensioner for the bearing. The cover had been put over that, so it wasn't even sitting on the bearing correctly. May have even given them a premature wear on the bearings. That might have been the main reason why they wore out so much, but we don't know. We're only speculating with that. But we'll get the new ones back in there perfectly, and that will be absolutely fine once it goes out. So we'll get the brakes off as well. This bike was running on Sram Red. We don't see an awful lot of the Sram group sets in our shop. 99% of group sets are Shimano, so it was nice to see a little bit of Sram on a bike, and the Sram Red is a lovely group set. Very precise on the changing of the gears, and everything about it is quite nice actually. I quite like Sram. Now we're just going to get the chain set of parts so we can get those chain rings cleaned up in between them, because again this is a full strip down service, so we do go that extra mile. We often see in comments, why didn't we do this or why didn't we do that? You do have to remember we're a working shop, so the servicing that we bring you on the YouTube videos, they range. They can be a standard, straight, quick and easy service that we might record that is a mechanical service to get the bike absolutely perfect mechanically, right down to these full strip down and detail services where we do all the little details as well, the nuts and bolts that are rusty and the little things that aren't quite right. We will really go in depth with a service of this nature. So this bike will be absolutely spotless when it goes back to the customer and will be working absolutely perfectly. So we get everything washed down. We've put all these parts through the ultrasonic cleaner now, so they've gone through. We're just going to wash off that degreaser because obviously you don't want that still to be on the components when we're trying to then re-lubricate and oil them. So we get all that off, wash it all down, dry all these parts off by hand, and then at that stage we then start to re-lubricate. So again, you can see with the chain set, we've done this in 2 or 3 loads on this bike. Clean up the actually metal greasy parts, so the chain and the cassette are the last ones to go in, and we use a little bit of heat on those, but we don't use heat on anything else. So a little bit of heat on those and then wash them down, and you can see how that chain is coming up there. Came up absolutely beautiful, this bike. And even things like the bottle holders, we wash those down as well on a full detail, so we get those off. And these jockey wheels actually weren't too bad, but they do have their own bearing in the centre there. The bearings were absolutely perfect, they felt absolutely fine, so I didn't get those too degreased, too much degreaser on them. Just a little wipe with a rag and a little on the surface of the jockey wheel itself to bring those up absolutely perfectly. Sram is very similar to Shimano in that we use the Loctite 222 on the jockey pulley wheels, bolts, and then even things like the thumb adjusters, I lubricate those just to make my servicing moving forward a little bit easier, to stop those components seizing within the derailleur itself, which makes future adjusting a little bit easier as well. So that's what I'm also doing when I'm lubricating and servicing a bike. Also kind of looking to my next service and how that bike is going to react to bad weather and everything between servicing, just to make sure that the bike is nice. So I'll lubricate even things like the skewers A little bit of general purpose grease on the skewer shaft itself to stop that sticking in the hub of the wheel. A little bit of copper slip on the threads, again just so that I know that I can get that undone in the future. Now this was another little problem we found on this brake here. You can see that spring should sit in that little U-shaped piece there. That's actually what you use to adjust the brake, and it was actually popped out at some point, so the brake had a very weak release. So we've just popped that back into its fitting there like that, and the spring felt much better after that. But not only that, it made it much easier to adjust on the bike to centralize the rim of the bike in the center of the brake. Again, another thumb adjuster here, so again a little bit of lubrication on that, general purpose grease, copper slip anti-seize grease on the threads, and then lubricate the pivot points of the brake as well. And I also just used a little bit of silicone grease on that slider, because the silicone won't wash off so much as the general purpose grease, and it just lubricate that when it's a metal in rubber or metal sliding fitting like that. Get the chain set together. So we've lubricated the bolts as well on this, and just a little bit of lubrication on the chain set itself just to stop it sticking together. Tighten them up, and then with the chain set I will always torque that up at this stage so that everything is in its final position for adjusting the front derailleur. So I always make sure that chain sets are torqued up before I go right through the bike. Lovely carbon fibre chain set on that one as well, and that was quite nice to see. Now look at this rear wheel bearing. I mean, I could barely turn that with my fingers. It was almost seized, it was almost solid. When he came in, he'd said that the bike wasn't freewheeling very well, and I can see why. I couldn't move that at all. So we're going to get this wheel apart, get that hub off, get these bearings out, and give everything a clean up, new bearings, and it should be fine. So listen to that. I mean, you can hear everything you need to hear. You know that bearing's worn out. So we're going to get the new wheel bearings in there. So we just tap out the old ones, and you can actually see the rust forming around the seal there. So this would have had a hardened seal ball in the race itself. We actually fitted a stainless steel race with stainless steel balls. The much nicer bearing that went in this, so that should stop that rusting effect. They will just wear out in future rather than rust out, and I think that's what happened with this bike. It probably got very wet at some point, then had sat, maybe even been took off the bike that they were previously on. This customer had then brought them as a used wheel, and they obviously needed new bearings, so we sorted that out for him. Hub as well, we replaced the bearings in this, so we give that a little clean up again through the ultrasonic cleaner. That gets right deep in everything before we re-lubricate it, and even the caps we put those through, and they're ready for refitting on the bike and indeed re-lubricating, which I'll show you the reason why as we move on with this wheel. So next up, we just clean the inside the hub there, the little teeth that the paws run against inside the hub. A little bit of wire wool. We need to make sure the seats of the bearings are all clean, and there was quite a bit of rust inside this wheel, so we needed to make sure all that was off. Fortunately, this part of the wheel was aluminium, so it did clean off. The rust had all come from the bearings, and it just clogged everything up. Wash the wheel down. It's just nice to have everything clean before you start putting bearings back into a wheel. And if you knock bearings out and press new ones in, you've always got the risk of getting grit and dirt into those, so it's just nice to have everything fresh. Just going to put a little bit of grease on here just to help this new bearing go into the bike, into the hub rather, and we just use our bearing press here just to pull those into the hub itself. We just nicely squeeze them in and slide them in, and they sit on their seats. There's a little clip goes in that one which I've just put in, and then the second bearing in the hub. So there's actually 4 bearings on this wheel, 2 in the hub, 2 in the wheel itself, all pressed in nicely, and then the wheel will actually spin and run lovely after this. Again, a little bit of grease on the seat. It is a press fit bearing, but the grease itself just helps it slide into its seat, into its final position just nicely. It just helps them glide in. A little bit of lubrication. So again, with the hub itself, a little bit of grease, you don't need too much, but it just slides it inside the bearing and just puts everything nicely together. And of course it does mean that if ever I do replace the bearings in this wheel, they will also come out a little bit easier as well with that grease. So there's no harm in greasing your bearings or the cups just to help them go in. I mean, look how smoothly that goes in, straight in, lovely really. And then I just using a little bit of silicone grease here. There is actually a rubber seal around the caps that go on the wheels, so even those I've lubricated, but again with a little bit of silicone because it's on rubber. A little bit of DT Swiss grease on the paws and the hub. Very nice grease, the DT special grease for hubs. It's specifically for hubs itself, so I'm just using that in there. And again, a little bit of silicone on a little rubber seal that goes inside that cover cap on the bearing there. and then a little bit of general purpose grease before I put on the cassette. So you can see the cassette's looking like brand new, absolutely perfect. Get the lock ring on there, torque that up because I can't do that once it's on the bike. So again, torqued up nice, and now we'll just move to this frame. I've said it before in videos, I love coloured bikes and I love gloss bikes. Just a big fanboy of them, and this one with that open weave of the carbon showing under the lacquer, what a lovely frame this one was. Look how that is popping out. So what are you riding? What colours are you riding? Tell us what colours you're riding in the comments. Do you like gloss frames? Do you like matte frames? I'm a fanboy of this lovely old gloss work on a bike. I just love a gloss frame. So tell us what you're riding in the comments below. And Simon has actually said to me, thanks to all those who've subscribed so far, and if you haven't subscribed, subscribe. So for those who don't know, I'm Lee, that's me in the videos. Simon is my son. He does all the filming, all the editing, all the uploading to the YouTube. So do subscribe for him, please. So I've polished this frame down with Auto Glim resin polish, and now I'm just ceramic coating this frame with Auto Glim ceramic spray. It just gives that little bit of protection way above and beyond what polish can on its own. The polish will clean and shine the frame, but that ceramic coating just stops the dirt and debris sticking to the frame. Makes it way easier to clean down in the future, and the water will just run off this frame. So next up, we're going to start rebuilding the bike. So just put a little bit of grease inside the bearing housing itself, just so that I know that those bearings will go into that housing nice and smoothly. We're using a nice stainless steel bearing, top quality bearings. Press them back in with a good quality press that will keep them nice and square to each other. I can feel those with my fingers, they feel absolutely spot on. A little bit of grease doesn't hurt when I rebuild the chain set. It'll help it just run into those bearings nice and smoothly without causing any damage. So they're in nicely. This is the cap that was missing off this side previously, so we get that cap back on there, get everything torqued up on the chain set itself, and then I can just adjust the bearing preloader on the non-drive side, which we actually did off camera, but that's now adjusted nicely. Get the front derailleur on, just set that in its right position, cable back on with that one, and then we can get the rear derailleur and hanger back on the bike, so we effectively get all the gearing onto the bike, and then we can do our adjustments and just get everything perfect. So we just get these back on. Everything's done pinch tight initially so that I can check my adjustments, make sure everything's right, and then I'll go through the bike with a torque wrench. Back on go the brakes themselves. Plenty of copper slip anti-seize on the bolts that go into the frame. That will just stop them sticking. The front was a little bit unusual in that it was threaded into the frame and then dropped through before the bolt, which was essentially like a lock bolt on this one, goes in. So again, plenty of copper slip on that. When I take the bike apart again in the future, that should stop any corrosion inside there. Get the wheels back on. Bike's really coming together now. We'll get the brakes and their cables back into their correct positions, do a little bit of adjustments on those to make sure that they're pulling evenly onto the braking surface and not actually pulling the wheel itself over to one side until they meet, because that can put a strain on spokes and the bearings. So I just made sure that also that they were central to the wheel. Get the chain back on. I mean, the chain looked like brand new, and I even put a little bit of copper slip into the threads of these fittings for the bottle cages, just to make sure that, again, moving down the line, we're not going to get corrosion problems in those, so that if ever the bottle cages need to come off, they've been greased and lubricated and they should be fine. A little bit of adjustment on the rear derailleur. I actually needed a little bit of adjustment just to get that changing perfectly. Front was actually almost perfect coming on and off the bike, but we just had the tail there was a little bit longer because I just lowered that derailleur slightly from its original position. So we just shortened the cable and made that perfect. Check the brakes, so I'm now happy that everything there is working right. So now we can go through the bike and torque it up. So initially I start on the hoods and the handlebars. So we check that the brake levers themselves are at the correct torque, check the crown bolts of the stem here that they're at the correct torque. And actually these stem bolts we actually replaced. They were a little bit corroded, and again, because this was a full detailing service, we're going to swap those out with some nice stainless steel bolts. Then you won't have the corrosion problem moving forwards. So get our nice new bolts in there, torque those up. You can actually see the torque setting on the side of that stem there, torque 6 Newton meters. So that's what we did, we torqued those to 6 Newton meters. Torque up the brakes. So we've now done the front section of the bike. So now we move to the central section of the bike, which will include chain set, front derailleur, seat post and saddle, pedals. So we just go through the center section, getting everything there right. Often the saddle's loose, and in this instance it was actually okay. And then we do the rear triangle, so it'll be rear brake, rear derailleur, all the pinch bolts, and finally we're at the stage where we can inflate the tyres just to make sure this bike's absolutely ready to ride away from the shop. So we get those inflated, and now the bike is looking really nice, everything's spot on, and the final detail for us is just to lubricate the chain. So I actually do this after I've checked all the gearing and everything, because I can then make sure that everything's right without getting everything oily. So you can see what a huge difference we've made to this bike. It looks absolutely beautiful. The SRAM on it is lovely. The carbon fibre is absolutely popping out at us with the shine, all ceramic coated, and I think you'll agree we've made a huge difference. So if you've enjoyed this video, please do subscribe. We'll see you again next Wednesday. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.